Hannibal back here for my fourth entry into my draft book. Uh, bef- Before I do part four, which is going to be about Matrats and my introduction to pro wrestling, back in 2001, which was a big year for me. There's a couple notes I want to do from chapter three, which is about my amateur wrestling career. So I'm just gonna, because I am doing these live. I do think of a few other things after. One thing I forgot to mention for amateur wrestling, one of the highlights of my amateur wrestling career in 2001 was there was a tournament at my high school that year. It was the Eastern Championship Finals of the city, which, as I said, I didn't even get a point scored on me in city competition that year. When I had my gold medal match, school was still in, but the teachers that liked me allowed their classes to get out to watch my gold medal match. So there was like, I would say 700 to 800 people watching my gold medal match, and it was so loud. It was just crazy loud when I won that. So that was one of my highlights. The other thing I wanted to mention was I mentioned earlier that I hated high school at first before I started doing great in sports. And at first, wrestling was not popular when I got into high school, so I was considered very uncool. Then, when it got popular and I became a top athlete, I became considered like very popular. So, as I mentioned, I had taken like all these courses in grade 9 and 10 during night school and summer school. They were called reach ahead courses because I wanted to try and finish high school early. But in the end, I just ended up with so many extra credits that this is kind of funny. For my last semester of high school, I was already accepted into the University of Buffalo and Simon Fraser, so I didn't even really have to go to high school. My last semester, I went during the amateur wrestling season to qualify, but then the rugby season started, which was like April, May, and June. And this is so funny. The they let me just go. I stopped going to school because I didn't really want to do the classes. So I just showed up for the practices, and the coach told me as long as I went to school on the day of the games, they would still let me play. So I would just literally show up after high school, do the rugby practices every day, and hang out with my friends. And then the day of the games, I would show up in the classes. But here's the funny part: we had a feud. Crean Wilson and Glebe Collegiate. We had one game that was very very rough. Then we had a playoff game where one of our smaller guys got kicked in the face. So I ended up getting in a fight with the guy that kicked him in the face in the game, which was totally one-sided from me, to the point that all of the teammates jumped in and tried to start beating me up, to pull me off of the other guy. They did no damage. I was kicked out of the rest of the game. But here's the funny part. One of my friend's dads was in the crowd, standing close to the principal and the coach, and there was like a little discussion. The principal is like, should we suspend Devin from from school for getting into this fight? Because they were kind of discussing, well, it was a game fight and it was kind of like deserving. I was protecting the other guy. But then the coach is like, I don't even think Devin goes to classes anymore. So what's this suspension going to do? So it's just funny that that happened. But that was a fun game. But let me jump into Matrats. As I did mention, I was accepted to Simon Fraser University at Buffalo. I had scholarships to both of those schools and was planning to attend those schools in September of 2001. However, around June of 2001, there was stories about Eric Bischoff. Keep in mind, WCW just went out of business. They went out of business in like March or April 2021. So WCW was fresh in people's mind, and there was big stories that Eric Bischoff and Jason Hervey, his partner, who was from the Wonder Years, was working with the Hart family in Calgary to do a kids wrestling league. Um, and they were like putting out notices. It was going to be based in Calgary. It was funded by a guy named Graham Owens, who apparently was a drug trafficker. He was smuggling drugs through his private plane across the U.S. border through Montana. That's where his money was coming from. He ended up doing about 10 years in jail for it, I believe. There was a big thing about it. We didn't know that at the time, obviously. But anyways, I sent videos of my amateur wrestling matches into the Matrats people, as well as this airband kung fu fighting thing I had done in high school with my friends to show my entertainment side. And they contacted me quickly back, saying that they were doing a TV pilot that was supposedly going to be for MTV that July with Mauro Ranallo, Don Callis, Joey Styles, Eric Bischoff was going to be there, Ted Hart, TJ Wilson, Harry Smith, Rene Dupree, Rick Victor, who ended up being in WWE, Randy Myers, who used to be involved. Anyway, it was a big thing. And they said they were going to fly me to Calgary for 2 weeks, train me how to wrestle in that 2 weeks, and do the pilot. And the pay was going to be like $500 Canadian. So to me, I mean, that just sounded like a lot of fun. As I said, Eric Bischoff, I was a huge WCW fan. I was more of a Nitro and Thunder fan than I was of Raw. So this was like a dream come true to me. So I go down there. Ted Hart is supposed to be the trainer. I think I ended up having 2 training classes with Ted, and then Leo Burke was hired, who was a maritime and Calgary wrestler, Stampede wrestler. We did 1 training session with Leo Burke where he showed us how to bump. It was supposed to be, keep in mind, 2 weeks of continuous training. There was 1 training session with Leo Burke showing us how to bump, and 1 with a guy named Ali, the Beast from the Middle East, who I've interviewed on this channel. Good guy, who was a local wrestler, showing us how to lock up. And then Ted and TJ, who ended up being Tyson Kidd in WWE and is still a producer for WWE. Oh, Natalia was involved in this too. Natalia was the announcer, and her and TJ are married now. But Ted and TJ choreographed this match. We maybe practiced this match 5 or 6 times. So I had a total of about 3 training sessions and about 5 or 6 run-throughs of the match by the time my first match happened, which was a handicap match, me against 4 or 5 guys. One of them was Randy Myers, who ended up having a lot of matches with in Stampede. But I'll tell you, I think for about 4 days before, 3 or 4 days before the actual taping, Eric Bischoff was in Calgary. And he gave us 2 speeches during those 4 days. And one of them was a big speech that everyone said his failure in WCW was he was using guys that were too old. And by the way, this is before Ric Flair and Hogan, and a lot of those older guys ended up back in WWE years later, because this was right in 2001. This was as the invasion was happening. I remember all the Matrats people. We all watched the invasion pay-per-view together, because it was during the time that we were training for the pilot. Oh, Jack Evans was involved in this too, by the way. So there was a lot of guys that ended up having names in the wrestling business, and most of our careers aren't over yet. But Matrats actually had a great roster of talent that probably could have gone somewhere had it been better organized. All this kids wrestling funded by a drug smuggler. And you guys could search up Graham Owens drug smuggling and see what kind of a slime ball this is. By the way, he never paid any of us, to my knowledge. Never ended up paying any of us. I got a T-shirt and a free flight, and I guess free accommodations while I was there. But yeah, Eric Bischoff gave a big speech on how the reason he was involved in this project, he had a lot of confidence because we were all kids. I was 17 still. Harry was like 14. Ted may have been in his very early 20s. Same with TJ. But yeah, getting these speeches from Eric Bischoff, who was straight out of WCW, was highly motivating. And again, I was pretty much right, like my high school ended in June. This is like early July. So to go from high school, where we won our rugby championship in June, matter of weeks later, they had a professional studio. Davey Boy Smith was there, by the way, hanging out with Harry, and Davey Boy was very, very nice. I mean, you go from high school to like hanging out with Eric Bischoff, the British Bulldog, and the Hart family just a matter of weeks later. So I was like in heaven. And the plan was okay for the pilot itself. I was involved in like a skit with TJ, Ted, and Harry, and then I had the match. I would say for my first match, I mean, it should have been practiced more. It wasn't horrible. For the skit, I accidentally headbutted TJ in the jaw. Again, I wasn't trained, and split his jaw open, and I'm still sorry about that to TJ to this day. But again, I wasn't properly trained, and this was at a place called the Palace. It was a bar slash theater in Calgary. There may have been 300 to 400 people there. I don't exactly remember. There was a lot of paid extras dancing, like young girls that were paid to be dancing in the audience because they really wanted this kid vibe to the show. I remember that Mauro Ranallo was very, very, very jealous that they had hired Joey Styles and Don Callis to be on the commentary team. And again, there's 2 more guys from ECW I was starstruck by. But Mauro was jealous, and he actually flipped out. And of course, we later learned that he has all these mental health problems. But Mauro had like a breakdown the day of the Palace show, and it ended up he did commentary by himself, even though they had flown Don Callis and Joey Styles in. They just ended up watching the show. And it's funny because I remember at the time thinking to myself, and I know I always got along with Mauro, never had a problem with him, but I remember at the time thinking to myself, he's throwing a tantrum walking off the set, and I'm thinking to myself, who is this guy? Because at that time, he had been the TV commentator for Stampede Wrestling, the relaunch of Stampede Wrestling with Bruce and Ross Hart, which was on the A channel in Calgary. So he was like a nobody. And I'm thinking to myself, why is he flipping out that they want Don Callis and Joey Styles to do commentary? They're way more famous, and I'm trying to think, like, why is everybody catering to Morrow? In the end, Morrow ended up being more famous as a commentator than Joey Styles and Don Callis, although they both had good careers, and Don Callis is like the top agent or it's not an agent, the top manager in AEW now. So, anyways, the show went well, and they were telling us, they were telling me basically that it was Graham Owens and Ted, which later I learned I should never trust Ted, who's pretty much disappeared off the face of the earth. The last I heard of him, he's had many legal problems over the last few years, but the last I heard, he had a court date for an MDMA related arrest in Florida that he didn't show up to. But Ted was saying he would, if I moved back there and didn't take my scholarships, and I came to Calgary in September, that he would get me a place to live, and he would train me full time to be a pro wrestler. So when the pilot got picked up, I would be ready to wrestle, because at this time they were fairly confident it was going to get on MTV. And as I said, with all these stars, and by the way, there was a Matrats studio where they had done a few smaller pilots earlier, which was a very professional TV studio, highly professional TV studio. And then the Palace show, they had the professional lighting grid, a real camera crew. Like it seemed very professional, and with all the stars there. I mean, I remember Jason Hervey from the Wonder Years at this time. I had watched the show, so I'm a total mark here, giving me advice on my wrestling match. So again, it was like, go to amateur wrestling, which the only reason I was in amateur wrestling was to become a pro wrestler, or just go straight into pro wrestling. So I stupidly ended up turning down my scholarships and going to Calgary to train for Matrats. But in the end, the show didn't get picked up. Ted's training that he said he was going to give me, I think he gave me 1 or 2 training sessions from the period of September to December 2001. He didn't end up getting me a place to stay. I ended up working at a job where I was loading boxes all day, and it was a very, very tiring job. I remember it was so tiring, and it started at like 5 in the morning, that it's funny. I ended up getting fired from this job because there was a staff meeting. It was basically loading boxes all day. Like you're nonstop loading boxes onto a conveyor belt, and it started at 5 in the morning. I've never been an early riser, so on the days that we worked, it was like 5 a.m. to 3 p.m. I was exhausted, but I remember I was so exhausted after about 3 or 4 months of doing this job. They had a staff meeting, and I fell asleep during the staff meeting, because it's like, you can stay awake if you keep moving, but the moment you stop moving, you're going to fall asleep. And I remember I fell asleep during this staff meeting. And also, by the way, I was dealing with a haunted house, which I'll get into next. I was living in a haunted house because Ted never ended up getting me the place to stay. I was rooming and boarding at this house that ended up being haunted. So I was dealing with the haunted house, not getting much sleep, and I'm not an early to bed guy to begin with. So they have this staff meeting. I fall asleep in the staff meeting. They wake me up, give me a speech about how that's the most insulting thing that anyone's ever done to them, to fall asleep during a staff meeting while they're talking. And then here's the funny thing. I fell asleep again right after that speech. And then they woke me up again. They're like, sorry, you've insulted us too much. You're fired, but you can work another 2 weeks if you want." So I worked another 2 weeks. And then it seemed like nothing was going to happen with Matrats. The studio was, I think, ended up being, the lease was over or whatever, so they lost the studio. Here's a funny story about the studio. I'll say before I close up on the Matrats part. At one point in time, I had a girlfriend there that was like 10 years older than me at the time. She was the one that ended up taking my virginity. I met her very soon after um, getting into Matrats. Um, anyways, at one point we got a suite at a hotel because I couldn't have her over to the place where I was rooming and boarding, and she was having an issue at her place. The roommate she had set up cameras in her area of the house and in the bathroom, and had been spying on her. So she ended up getting a settlement out of that. But she was living with her parents at that time, so we wanted to basically have sex. We got a suite somewhere, and Ted and his girlfriend at the time, they ended up sleeping on the pull-out couch because we had hung out the night before. Then Ted takes us to the studio to show her the studio. And I'm not sure if this was the girl that Ted has a kid, by the way. At this point in time, the kid, I think, was still living with Ted. I'm not sure. I don't think this woman that was with Ted and I were friends at this time, even though he wasn't training me. We did become friends. And I think he had a different girl than the girl he had the kid with. And we were all at this hotel, but we both wanted to show the girls the studio to look like big shots after. And I remember we were left alone in the studio for like an hour to an hour and a half because Ted took my car to do something with the other girl. And I remember having sex with the girl I was with in the Matrats ring, which was very, very fun. I remember I had her on the ropes, bouncing on the ropes and stuff. I was the only time I ever had sex in a wrestling ring. So that's kind of relevant as far as the ghosts story. I mean, I remember it was Halloween of 2001. Since I never ended up getting the place to stay, I remember, it's funny. Ted said I could train at his dad's gym for free. He would hook me up with a place to stay. I remember after a couple times training at his dad's gym without paying, his dad approached me and said I had to start paying, even though his son had kind of told me, "Hey, by the way, turn down your scholarships, move out to Calgary. We're getting this pilot picked up." And again, I'm young and naive. My parents were very, very mad at me during this time, by the way, extremely mad at me for turning down their scholarships. Piss off your parents, go to Calgary, turn down your scholarships. You're the number one amateur wrestler in the country. You're still the reigning national champion. You're still technically on the junior national team. Quit all that. Go to Calgary. I'll take care of you. You can work out for free. I'll get you a place to stay. I ended up having to get a gym membership. My parents had a friend of a friend that I could have room and board with in the end, which of course I ended up having to pay for through that box job. And I did do some bouncing during that time. Not much, mostly relief. Anyways, the son lived in the basement. The basement was like a mini apartment of this place I was staying. And of course, anyone that's been following my channel knows I'm interested in the paranormal. I always have been. Back when I was a kid, my parents had bought me a Ouija board, and I had used the Ouija board with my brothers and friends, and actually had some luck getting the Ouija boards to work at my parents' house in Ottawa, but nothing that relevant happened out of using the Ouija board there, other than at one point someone claiming to be a relative of mine who had died recently that I had a decent relationship with, had claimed to have contacted me, but we didn't take it very seriously. Anyways, I remember it's Halloween 2001. This kid's parents were away. For some reason, they did not like Ouija. There was always some weird stuff that was going on in that house, apparently, and the parents did not want Ouija board in the house, but they were gone for this Halloween. And I remember we had rented Leprechaun, the movie Leprechaun, which I still like to this day, with Jennifer Aniston. And we had also rented a movie called Rumpelstiltskin, which was a scary version of Rumpelstiltskin to celebrate Halloween. And I had gone out and I had bought a Ouija board, and we were going to use the Ouija board. So again, I had had random experiences with Ouija boards. We're using it. It's working. It's talking to us, but it keeps saying no. It doesn't want to talk to us. Every time I'm asking the Ouija board to talk to us, will you talk to us? Will you talk to us? It keeps going to no. So eventually, probably at a fifth or sixth time it goes to no, all the power shuts off in the house. Again, we had the TV on, watching one of these movies as we're playing this Ouija board. The power was on in the house. At the exact time the Ouija board goes to no, all the lights go off in the house. The TV shuts down. Like, there's no way that could have been faked. It was just me and the kid in the house. It was a very nice kid. Um, so yeah, that freaked us out. We ended up telling the parents about that. They told me, get that thing out of the house. You got to leave it in the car. The next week, I wake up to go to the bathroom, and this living room, there was a downstairs living room that was directly in front of my room with one of these basement windows, right? So there's a light shining through the basement window. So you can see into the living room, but just through the window light, but it's good enough to see. So I get up, I open the door to go to the bathroom, and I'm looking into the living room before I turn left to walk down the hallway to the bathroom, and the rocking chair in the living room is rocking by itself. And I'm like, holy shit. How is this possible? Keep in mind the window was closed. This is November in Calgary by this point. It's freezing out. There's no wind or anything, and this is a wooden rocking chair. So I turn on the light. The rocking chair stops moving. I'm like, okay, I'm imagining this. I turn the light back off. The rocking chair starts moving again. Turn the light back on. The rocking chair stops moving. Turn the light back off. The rocking chair starts moving again. So at this point, I just turn the light on for the rest of the night. And basically, the paranormal stuff, there was continued paranormal energy in that house for the rest of my time there. I ended up having issues sleeping. I ended up moving with this girl because I was getting so freaked out. Now being 41 years old, I would have actually found that interesting. But at 17, 18 years old, I think I had just turned 18, October 16th. I mean, I was freaked out by this. And I ended up moving briefly with this woman. And then in that January, since nothing was going on with Matrats and to train, I had wrestled a few Stampede wrestling matches at this point that were called on the fly, and I had no idea how to wrestle. So I just basically got beat up by the veterans. But at that time, to train in Calgary with the Hearts was $3,000. So I was out of money. I had lost that box job for falling asleep. And like, there was no reason at that point for me to stay in Calgary. I knew Jacques Rougeau had a school in Montreal, so I figured, okay, I'm going to go back to Ottawa, train with Jacques Rougeau, get better at wrestling, live with my parents, save up some money, and then try and go back and train at the dungeon. So so there you go. That's my Matrats part. If I forget anything, I'll put it in part 5, which is going to be about training with Jacques Rougeau. Steve says, "Happy 420." It's Devin, or you can just call me Hannibal. You can call me anything you want. I really don't care. Happy 420 to you. I stopped doing weed due to I don't know. I just lost interest in it. Had a bad experience. By the way, at this point in time, um, I may have smoked weed once with Ted, but I didn't like it. So anytime I hung out with Ted, I was not smoking weed. I did in Calgary, the legal age was 18. So once I turned 18, I did go out here and there. I worked in the bars, but I wasn't partying or anything at at this point in time in my life. So I was still fairly innocent. And yeah, if it keeps you off opioids and back pain, good for you. I was for about 2 or 3 years. I was eating the cookies and gummies fairly regularly, but I had a bad experience um, with a weed drink that caused me some weird hallucinations. So ever since then, I really stopped doing weed, but I don't have anything against it. It's way better than alcohol for people. But yes, happy 420 to everybody. That is my Matrats portion of the book. Oh, by the way, the one last thing I'll say about the Matrats portion of the book, in 2004 I did end up getting used by WWE in Ottawa, and Eric Bischoff was at that. Sorry, WWE in Calgary. I got a tryout, which I'll talk about later, where I was used as an extra, and I brought up Matrats to Eric Bischoff, and he just completely kayfabed Matrats like he had no idea what I was talking about. Because I remember I was still a fan of Eric Bischoff, and even to this day I like Eric Bischoff. But I remember going up to him at that show in Calgary. I forget what. I think Bischoff was with Johnny Nitro at that time. And I remember going up to Eric Bischoff and be like, "Yeah, I was in Matrats with you," and he was just like, "Oh, hey, nice to meet you." He completely kayfabed the Matrats thing. So there you go. That's the portion of this book. The book itself might be more detailed, but that's a draft part about Matrats. Enjoy 420, everyone.